You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the nonprofit news outlet exploring solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm the host, Travis Loop. This conversation comes to you from the Reservoir Center in Washington, D.C., where Waterloop is the media partner. Before we dive into the episode, I want to thank you, the audience, for making this platform possible. To support Waterloop, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Thanks for being part of the conversation. In this episode, Radhika Fox, former head of EPA's Office of Water, shares how she helped lead the largest federal investment in U.S. water infrastructure, advance PFAS regulation, and expand environmental justice efforts. Radhika reflects on her path to leading federal water policy, shaped by experiences at the San Francisco PUC and the U.S. Water Alliance. Plus, she shares what she's working on now, from sector disruption and AI to impact investing and democracy renewal. Radhika, I am so happy to sit down with you to have a conversation. You've always up to so many different things. I wanted to ask you used to ask people a question about like what their favorite water body or type of water was. Yeah. What was that question that you always asked people, and why did you do that?
The reason that I do that is it immediately connects people back to purpose. And, I've asked that question of, my children. I've asked that question of senators when I was going through the confirmation process, mayors, community organizations, and it usually elicits a memory of family, of community, and it really, I think, speaks to the fact that water is a really great uniter. So that's why I start with that.
And I think I've heard you give your answer, but could you remind me of what your answer is to that question?
So mine is the Pacific Ocean because I raised my kids in Pacifica, California, and I feel like my son kind of learned how to walk, on the beach, and just those memories of them and the water and time spent with family. But what about you, Travis? What's your favorite body?
I am an ocean saltwater person through and through. I don't know if I could pick I grew up on the Atlantic. I went to college in Wilmington, North Carolina at the beach. But I lived in Hawaii for 5 years, so I had a lot of time in the Pacific too. So just give me the salt water and I am happy. Yeah.
You go big.
Exactly. I do a little series called Water Street Questions here at the Reservoir Center from Water Street. So I'm going to ask people that question as one of the next ones. I want to do a past, present, future conversation with you because there's a lot of things to talk to you about. You served as the head of water for EPA, the assistant administrator for the Office of Water. I was disappointed that you were not my communications director, Travis.
I
know. That would have been fun.
That would have been fun.
Yeah, I was there under the Obama administration. You were there for President Biden. The thing I'm curious about is your experiences before. Could you kind of summarize some of the things you did before EPA and how they set you up for that role? I'm always interested in how people come to that position and what they bring to it.
Yeah. Happy to. It was not something I ever thought I would do. So it is, how sort of life leads you to where it leads you. So for me, I actually did not start my career in water. I got a master's in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley, and after that I worked for about a dozen years with a national policy organization called PolicyLink that was based in Oakland, California. And really a lot of the work that I did there was looking holistically at the built environment and the role of the built environment, whether it's transit systems or housing or other infrastructure, and the way that it shapes opportunity for people and how those kinds of place-based investments also really create thriving communities. And I feel like I sort of fell into water a little bit accidentally. I had a friend of mine who was part of the senior leadership at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And so she approached me. They were creating a new position to lead national partnerships and government affairs. working very closely with the general manager there. And so she reached out to me and said, you really should, look at this. You'd be great for it. And I was like, why would I want to work at the water department, right? Like, you don't really think about the water department. Sure. And you write a check for your bill every couple months. And so really, and what she said to me is all of the things you care about, infrastructure, jobs, community vitality, public health, you can achieve all of those things through water. And that's how I ended up at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and absolutely fell kind of in love with just the many dimensions of water. And with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, it's the third largest public utility in the state of California, and it's drinking water, stormwater, wastewater, and also municipal power, because the water system is gravity fed, and San Francisco's water comes from Yosemite through a gravity fed system, and we generate power through that. And so that experience working in local government, but really with a one water approach and looking for those synergies when you have the opportunity to kind of work across that water life cycle. I was there, and then from there ran the U.S. Water Alliance. But I think my experience at the SFPUC was so important and grounding for my time as the assistant administrator. I think a lot of times when you read newspaper clippings and things about me taking on that role, a lot of folks talked about how I was the first woman of color to run the Office of Water at the EPA. But I often tell people I was the first person who was the assistant administrator who actually worked at a water utility, that has to comply with all the different regulations, whether it's the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act. And so I think that practical experience of when a regulation hits a community, right, or applies to a community, those considerations. And I really tried to bring that lived experience into the work I did at EPA. And then I think the experience at the U.S. Water Alliance, it was such a perfect next step after SFPUC, because the U.S. Water Alliance really has been championing One Water, right? And how do we think in an integrated way about the choices we make in water management? And I think the thing that I loved about building the U.S. Water Alliance was I got to be in relationship with all who are impacted by the choices we make. Water-reliant businesses, water utilities, of course, the NGOs and environmental groups, agriculture, right? So hearing those diverse perspectives and trying to find that uncommon common ground in water, that was really my work at the U.S. Water Alliance. I think that, again, that was so valuable when I served as America's top water regulator, because no one sector has the answer. I mean, Travis, you worked at the EPA as well. Like, it's about finding a common ground. Half the people think you went too far. Half the people don't think you went far enough. If everyone's kind of pissed at you, you probably found the right sweet spot in the choices you're making. And so I think that those diverse perspectives and the trying to be a collaboration platform for the sector, which is really what I was trying to do when I was at the U.S. Water Alliance. I think those were invaluable in kind of my time at EPA.
I always say about the One Water Summit that it's actually a place you can go to and have a lot of those silos broken down. It's the one kind of water conference where you have people that work on rivers and you have people that work on stormwater and all kind of and artists and all in the same room. One of the things that I remember you from at the U.S. Water Alliance is the Value of Water campaign and pushing for infrastructure investment. And that was a relentless push, a multi-year push, and it almost seemed at times like, pushing a rock uphill. Yeah. And then you get into EPA, and Congress comes along and passes this historic infrastructure investment package. And so all of that lobbying and advocacy kind of came to fruition, and then you're in a position to implement that funding. I'd like you to kind of talk about what that was like. This is, again, a little bit of a debrief of your time at EPA. What was that like putting that money out there, focusing on delivering it to communities?
Yeah, well, it was an absolute dream job, as you can imagine. But I'm so glad you mentioned the Value of Water campaign, because it was one of my absolute favorite things that I was able to be a part of when I was at the Alliance. And while the U.S. Water Alliance was kind of the home for it, it was really a collaboration across the industry. So, the Water Environment Federation, NACWA, core partners to that effort. It really felt like magic to kind of be at the EPA when the single largest investment the federal government has been made in water happened. And Travis, a funny story, like I remember it was my second week on the job, right, at EPA. And EPA is a very complicated place. You're sort of just getting your sea legs on. And I remember getting the first email from the White House in that second week, where we were starting to build the president's infrastructure proposal. And so really, from the very beginning of the president putting his proposal together, transmitting it to Congress, then all of the discussions and negotiations with Congress, to finally standing in that November of that first year, outside of the White House, when the president signed the bipartisan infrastructure law with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. And so it was incredible. And I think it's an important moment of when we come together as a nation, we can do big things, right? And infrastructure and water really can bring communities together. I think, because of the experience at the SFPUC, because of the experience at the U.S. Water Alliance, we were really ready to go. And because it was the bipartisan infrastructure law, it was a partnership with the states, right? A lot of the money was flowing through the SRF. So it was incredible. We certainly emphasized certain policy priorities that were important to the president, focusing really on making sure communities who historically had not benefited and gotten their fair of federal funding. That was a big piece of how we tried to deploy those dollars. But, Travis, it's working. There is billions of dollars in the system right now in communities around the country. We're only about halfway through that infrastructure spend. So I think we're going to see a lot more ongoing investment in communities, and I just can't wait to see all of the lives saved, communities improved because of it.
I think one of the challenges that people talk about is actually making sure that those dollars get to the communities. There's a lot of kind of steps they have to get through. So this technical assistance has been an area of emphasis. I know the past few years, lots of water people I talk to are saying, all right, how are we doing on this? How's it going? How can we improve it? How can we speed things up, et cetera, et cetera? What's your take on really how that is working, how that rubber's hitting the road, if you will?
Well, so on how it's going, I actually think it's going pretty well. I mean, if you think about how much more money is going through the system, it's pretty phenomenal, actually. I know people sometimes feel impatient, where they're like, where's the money? And of course there's a process that's set by Congress, right, where they appropriate the funds. EPA has to develop priorities and sort of provide that policy guidance. States have to develop their intended use plans. So, it is a whole process. But the fact that this much more money is going through the system and it's going, there's thousands of local assistance agreements, happening all around the country. And I think that's really a testament to the cooperative federalism that has been so fundamental to how we manage for water quality in this country, where the states are very seasoned at being able to get these state revolving fund dollars, the partnership with the regions, the EPA regions. So I think it's going well, and I think we're probably going to talk about technical assistance, but I think the question about making sure the money is getting out and to the uses that are most pressing, but also how do we make sure that as many communities as possible, that was the nut I was really trying to crack when I was at EPA.
One of the other shifts under the Biden EPA was leaning into environmental justice and equity.
Yeah.
Could you talk about kind of turning the ship in that direction a little bit more, and what that took, and maybe how turning the ship will have lasting impacts no matter
Yeah.
what's happening with administrations or policies?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, and obviously there are aspects of environmental justice that are right now very polarizing. What I can say about water is, when we got direction from the White House around things like Justice 40 and considering, making sure communities aren't left behind, what I saw in the Office of Water, really being receptive to it. And I think that's because for those, and a lot of these wonderful, dedicated career servants, at EPA, I mean, when you have an experience like a Flint, Michigan, right? When you think about the Jackson water crisis, when you think about McDowell County, West Virginia, where people have never actually ever gotten centralized water or wastewater service. I mean, they're living without the basics. Environmental justice isn't a word, right? It's not it is really about making sure that every single person in this country can live with basic human dignity. And I don't think you can live with basic dignity if you don't have clean, safe, affordable water, right? And so it wasn't a struggle, frankly, in the Office of Water. I think that the managers of the programs were excited to be charged with thinking about that. And Travis, one thing that was really quite surprising to me that I didn't realize till I was at EPA, but did you know that less than 20% of communities in this country have ever been able to successfully access federal water money?
Wow.
Less than 20% have
did
been
not know
able
that
to
stat.
use the SRF.
That's shocking.
And shame on us, right?
Yeah.
Like these are public dollars that really should benefit as many people as possible. And that was really the genesis of the thing I'm probably most proud of from my time at EPA, which is, we called it Water TA. And so alongside the $50 billion in water infrastructure money, we designed this a $500 million initiative that was very much focused on how do we build the technical, financial, and managerial capacity of water systems to be able to do the planning, the engineering, and actually to get on the list, to get on that intended use plan with an application. Now, the latest numbers as I know them is that there's about 1,500 communities around the country that are receiving Water TA. And many of them are rural communities who would never have ever accessed federal dollars were it not for this technical assistance. My understanding is that they're all across the country. They're in red states, they're in blue states, because I think, as water doesn't is not a partisan issue, right? Yep. If your water's clean, you thrive. If your water's dirty, it's a life or death situation. And so I think that was also a real innovation to build this pipeline of technical assistance that went alongside the pipeline of the infrastructure money.
One of the things that's been impactful about that money is, like you just said, it's getting to all types of communities, red states, blue states, red communities, blue communities. So that's impactful. You also mentioned that at EPA, if people aren't happy with you on one side and they're not happy with you on the other, that you probably found some kind of middle ground. That leads me to talk about PFAS.
Okay, yes.
One of the big challenges of our time, this chemical. We don't have to do the briefing on it. The audience is aware of PFAS. I'm very curious to kind of hear your thoughts from the inside on taking on that challenge from a water standpoint. I was there when the first health advisories were set up and was in meetings, and just it's very difficult. It's challenging to figure out where to go with that. Could you talk about it and how you approach that from a science, from a regulatory perspective?
So if you had told me that I would spend as much time on PFAS as I did when I was the assistant administrator, I did not necessarily expect that you sort of get called to do what you do and you have to do it. So.
It had to be definitely one of your biggest chunks of time.
Yes,
right? Just with
yeah. Well, infrastructure too, but a lot of things. But with PFAS, one of the things that happened early in our term was creating a PFAS executive council. So Administrator Michael Regan, who I know you know from North Carolina, had a very intense experience with PFAS because of the Cape Fear River and all of that.
Yep.
And so
that's my watershed. That's my
and that's your
river.
watershed.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
you know
Yeah.
as well as anyone.
Yeah.
And so, one of Michael's goals as an administrator was to try to break down the silos between the different offices who have various statutory authority to regulate things like PFAS. And and you will probably remember this from your time at EPA, but Office of Water might be doing a PFAS drinking water regulation. The Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention might be utilizing TSCA authority to try to keep PFAS out of the marketplace in the first place. OLM, might be thinking about their authorities under CERCLA and RCRA. And so the idea was, we will get to better outcomes if we think in a more integrated way as an agency. And if we had a framework and a point of view of how we were going to tackle PFAS. And so, Michael asked me to lead this executive council of PFAS and to kind of bring leadership across the agencies together. And so my first priority was really to establish a framework for why we were doing what we were doing so that we made the right choices and that we could communicate with stakeholders about why that was. And so the approach that we took was, I call it the 3 R's, and it's not because my name is Radhika, it just happened to be ours. So it was research, restrict, and remediate. So research, we need to continue to build a scientific foundation to inform policy, investment choices, et cetera. So, really investing in that research to make informed science-based, fact-based decisions. Restrict, right? Like we are never going to keep communities safe unless we turn the tap off of PFAS, right? Entering in the first place. And so what are the policies around restricting those chemicals and getting into our air, land, and water in the first place? And then remediate. Unfortunately, there are too many communities that either have drinking water that has PFAS in it, their land, their soil, their air, and so we also need to remediate. So we charged all of the offices around this research, restrict, remediate to build the PFAS action plan that ultimately came out. So it was both a really incredible experience to have an agency-wide view, and what was pretty cool is that the White House Council of Environmental Quality was really impressed with that kind of agency-wide approach and actually charged a number of other federal agencies to also develop their PFAS roadmap inspired by EPA. So you'll see other agencies have that too. And then in the context of the Office of Water, we were really thinking both about our Clean Water Act Authority as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act Authority in our approach to PFAS. Of course, I think the big ticket item or the one that of course got the most attention is the establishment of the first drinking water regulation for 6 PFAS, which I'm sure you're going to want to talk about. But yeah, it was a really incredible experience, though.
How do you balance on restrict and remediate, what's being asked of utilities with what's being asked of polluters? I think that's one of the conversations out there is like, these people are responsible for this. The burden should really be on them, but MCLs and all puts a lot of burden on utilities. How do you approach that?
It is obviously a complicated issue. I think we were trying to work on both the restrict and the remediate. Frankly, I'm very supportive of the polluter pays, and I think you saw that was a priority as far as utilizing enforcement. My view of it is the responsibility of the Office of Water is to set the standard to protect the American people, which is what we did with the MCL. And then it's responsible. We're all responsible for helping move into implementation. So I would be very supportive of Congress doing there's some active proposals around a polluter's pay kind of tax funding mechanism. I would absolutely support things like that because we do need to provide relief to water utilities who are, that's why we got, several $1 billion in emerging contaminant funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I think, and then frankly, the role of the private sector. I mean, I think that when you establish a clear regulation like the MCL, it sends important market signals around technology, innovation, driving down costs of solutions. And so I think that there is, you've got to sort of take all those pieces together.
Before we leave the EPA debrief, you mentioned the career staff, and I just wanted to linger or come back to that because I worked at EPA for 8 years, eight very proud years. I was always felt like one of the least intelligent people in the room.
Me too.
Because it's staggering, the knowledge, the dedication. So I just wanted to kind of get your reflections on those people, especially kind of during this time.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for that question. And honestly, that was one of the brightest spots in my time at EPA is, people don't often realize, these are folks who, they come out of college or a master's program in chemistry, biology, or they're lawyers, like all kinds of folks, and who just dedicate their entire lives to working for public health and in the public interest. And they are smart, they are hardworking, they're certainly not doing it for the money, I will tell you that. And so I find it so sad, really, the way that this notion of government and the administrative state is being kind of demonized. Because there's a lot of stuff that government does for people every day that makes their lives better. Yeah. And I think certainly are structural reform of a lot of these agencies needed? Absolutely. Is there bloat and inefficiency in places? Absolutely. But there is too in the private sector. And so I certainly hope that this isn't a throw the baby out with the bathwater sort of moment, because there's some just essential supports that those career staff are playing that we can't do on our own. There's a role for the common good, and that's a lot of what they're focused on.
Well, you mentioned how water doesn't see red or blue.
Yeah.
So
which isn't quite right, because it is blue, right? But you get what I mean.
You see a lot more blue water than red water.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. But when it comes to politics and polarization, and this time that we're in, how do you see water during this moment and the country's actions around water, or people's actions around water? Again, as we're in this very polarized time, this very political time, what does water look like moving forward?
I mean, for me, I think that I think in generations, right, when it comes to water. I think, if you even think about the technical assistance work, right, that I kind of seeded at EPA, I mean, at the end of the day, like the mom in McDowell County, West Virginia, and her children and her other family members, like that's a generational play when you sort of work to change the odds for communities like that. And if you think about kind of where we're going, from a planetary perspective, all of the mega trends are just pointing to the fact that we're going to have no choice but to prioritize water, right? Whether you think about the fact that the billions of people who are water insecure, right, are struggling with water scarcity, the fact that water quality all around the world is in peril, the fact that we have a changing climate and the water whiplash, right, where all of these megatrends really are like, whether we want to focus on water or not, we're going to have to, right? So the megatrends are hugely important when we think about water. And if you think about it, no part of human activity exists without water. So that's my view, right?
Going back to that value of water campaign,
exactly.
Right? Like, talk about just the economics of it all.
Right. And so I'm thinking in generational terms when it comes to water and what we need to do as a nation. But on the politics, right? One thing that is so interesting is as part of the November election cycle, there were more ballot measures focused on water than there had ever been. And almost all of them were approved by voters. There was one in upstate New York, there was one in Colorado, New Mexico, California. They were focused on flood resilience, they were focused on climate, they were focused on all, it's focused on gambling revenues to support clean water projects, all that kind of stuff. And so I think the other thing I hope politicians, right, across local, state, and federal will remember is that when you put water on the ballot, it wins. It is a winning issue. And so again, water is the great uniter, whether you think about culture, identity, community, or politics. And I certainly hope that the things that we started will continue because of that.
One of the questions I hear a lot is, what's Radhika doing now? What's Radhika up to? So I'm really curious.
People need to ask more interesting questions than that, but okay.
Yeah, well, it's true. So what are you up to? What are you doing with all your time, your experience, your expertise, your energy, all that kind of good thing?
Oh, well, I'm in this really wonderful kind of chapter of my career, which is really about, working with people that I like, who inspire me, and who are driven by purpose. And so we're actually here in the Reservoir Center, which is a space that Xylem has built for the water community here. And so one of the things that I do is I'm a senior advisor to Matthew Pine, the CEO here at Xylem, and some of his leadership team. And so I advise them on strategy, but one of the things that we are also working on is I chair something called the Water Sector Disruption Study Group. And it's really a recognition that there's so many disruptive forces that are shaping our economy, our society, the way that work is going to be organized, generationally. And so what we're doing is we're working with about 16 water utility CEOs really to kind of make sense of these disruptive forces. We talked about artificial intelligence, at the peril of it, the potential of it. How do we really think about strategically as leaders in the sector that it's deployed in the right ways for the right purposes? So that is one thing I'm doing. I also am working with philanthropy. For example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is the largest health foundation in the country, and they're really thinking about how do they use their impact capital. So tools like loans, loan guarantees to help accelerate investment in water infrastructure and other sectors as well. So I'm working with them on some projects around impact capital for water.
That intersection of health and water, right?
Yes,
You can't have one without the other.
Exactly. And I'm also, a part of this chapter is around widening the aperture of like staying grounded in water, but also working on related issues. So I'm also working with it's actually going home. So before I worked at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, I worked with a national public policy organization called PolicyLink. And so I'm an executive in residence at PolicyLink. And, next year is the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. And so there's a renewal moment that we have with that anniversary. And, so some of the work that I'm doing with PolicyLink is really just this recognition of the fragility of our democracy right now and the fragility of our governing institutions, and a recognition that right now there's so much us versus them. How do we find our way back to we the people and have a more non-rivalrous stance in how we relate to one another, whether it's at the community level or in how we make policy decisions? And so there's a body of investigative work I'm doing with them on getting our way back to we the people.
As we're sitting here at the Reservoir Center, something's happening that I think kind of underscores the conversation that we've had, and these are some dozens of mayors from across the Great Lakes region are coming to meet and then go up to the Hill and advocate for their water issues. So kind of bipartisan group, and it gets to everything I think we talked about.
I love mayors. Mayors are where the rubber hits the road,
That's it.
right?
That's it. Radhika, so glad to finally have this opportunity to catch up with you.
So good to see you, Travis.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to support Waterloop's ongoing exploration of water solutions, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Until next time, be water, my friends.
You're in the Waterloop.